Moving on now, Doctors Without Borders says over 100 migrants lost their lives earlier this month off the coast of Libya. The international medical charity said the asylum seekers died after two crowded rubber boats were wrecked. Sudanese, Malians, Nigerians, Cameroonians, Ghanaians, Libyans, Algerians and Egyptians were among those on board these vessels, which were bound for Europe. European rescuers came to help, but the survivors say that they were too late and they couldn't save many lives. According to the MSF, many of the surviving migrants were detained when they're brought back home and are kept in deplorable conditions. To discuss that more, we're joined by Mr. Edward Corrigan, international human rights lawyer, joining us live from Ontario. Thank you very much once again, Edward, Mr. Corrigan, for joining us on the Top 5 on Press TV. Now, regarding this recent development, Mr. Corrigan, what is your take on this situation? Well, we do know that these refugees are fleeing the conflicts and the terrible situations that they have in their own countries that are basically caused by Europeans in the first place. Why is not Europe taking that into consideration and thinking of some concrete solutions for this refugee crisis?
Well, the Europeans, as you say, are largely responsible for many of these problems. France, England, and Italy, sort of invaded Libya, murdered Gaddafi, and have created what is in essence a failed state. You have people being sold into slavery, and then you have the European Union paying large sums of money to the Libyan government in order for them to detain and pick up, refugee claimants at the Mediterranean, take them back, put them in prison under deplorable circumstances, and of course prevent them from going to Europe. So, and what happens to them, and a lot of them, of course, many people have died, thousands have died. There's been over 13,000 refugees that have tried to go to Europe that have been returned to Libya and put in deplorable, prison conditions. So, the big question is that when the Europeans and their American friend, attacked and destroyed, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, this created refugee flows. And, actually millions of refugees fled Syria. And of course, many people are fleeing Libya now. And Egypt, of course, there's been a coup and a dictatorship where people are being sentenced to death for merely participating in a peaceful protest against the overthrow of a democratic government, and of course the installation of an illegal government. And this is creating huge problems. Okay, but ultimately the Europeans could do a lot more, and of course they should look at themselves in the mirror and say that we are responsible for this. But the unintended consequence is, of course, these massive refugee flows to Europe, where you've got millions of refugees have fled the turmoil, the political turmoil, and the attacks on individuals in North Africa and elsewhere. But the other question is, why are these people fleeing Africa and fleeing these countries? And a lot of that depends upon the exploitation that the European powers have in Africa, where they are taking huge resources out, making lots of money, and of course giving little or nothing to the inhabitants of the country. So only maybe a tiny political elite gets the benefit, but the American and European multinational corporations and the European governments, of course, are getting a lot of money. For example, Gaddafi was, Europeans were charging the Libyans and Africans over $500 million a year to get access to European satellites in order to use their cell phones. So Gaddafi and two other groups put together $125 million and decided to put their own satellite up in space so they would cut the Europeans out. That, of course, didn't make the Europeans very happy, and is one of the primary reasons why they actually invaded Libya and destroyed Gaddafi and the government. And they really have no interest in creating a stable state. And of course, Libya before the invasion was a relative state producing minimal refugees. It wasn't really a problem. So the Europeans have created their own problem to a large extent. But this is a terrible situation. The refugees are not getting proper treatment. And it's in fact illegal for the Europeans to prevent these refugees from coming ashore. And I think, if nothing else, it's immoral for them to pay the Libyans to pick them up and take them home and put them in detention. So if a refugee gets to Europe under law, they have to be given asylum, but there's a lot of pushback now. Populism, is rife. There's a lot of nationalism, racism, which is being focused against these refugees. But again, there's a disconnect. The Europeans don't recognize that they, in fact, have caused a lot of these problems, and now they're not prepared to deal with the result of the problems that they themselves caused.
Mr. Corrigan, actually, you touched upon something very interesting. You said that it was illegal for the Europeans not to accept these refugees. Can you please elaborate more on that? We're running out of time, but I think this is an important issue we need to discuss.
If a refugee gets to a country, they can make a refugee claim, and under law, they are required to be accepted. However, the Americans have been shifting refugees into Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and saying this is not American territory, therefore they don't qualify under American law. Same thing in Europe. If they stop the refugees from coming ashore or sending them back to Libya, where in fact they may be tortured or refooled or put in detention under deplorable conditions, in my view, this is politically and legally unacceptable. But the Europeans are more concerned on pushing the refugees away and creating these barriers. And of course, when in fact, in this case, the Europeans came, they threw life jackets and lifesavers, but they did not, pick them up. If they picked them up, and they would have been able to make a refugee claim, and Europe, and so in that sense, they're creating, I think, a legal fiction where they're saying, oh, these people never made it to Europe, therefore they don't qualify under the 1951 Geneva Convention. But I think the reality is that this is not true. In fact, they're spending a great deal of money paying Libya and also blocking refugees from getting there and not looking at the real facts of the case. Some, yes, are economic migrants, but you have to ask yourself, why are these people so desperate to put their own lives and their families' lives in jeopardy to try to get out of Africa, get out of Libya, and get to Europe where they can at least entitled to economic and political help, and of course can make a refugee claim, which is being stopped. So, there's been, over 13,000 this year alone have been blocked and sent back to Libya. So this is, in my view, unacceptable, and has been criticized by Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other groups. So that Europeans are creating a barrier, which I think is unfortunate, and of course it has caused a lot of harm and unnecessary deaths for Europeans, for refugees trying to get to Europe. So this is the core of the problem. But we also don't look at the economic and political turmoil, which is an aftermath of European colonialism and neo-colonialism, and why some of these people are desperate to get out of the countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edward Corrigan, international human rights lawyer, joining us live from Ontario with his take on the situation of refugees trying to reach Europe.